All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today's Sunday, April the 6th. The other day I made a video that had a pretty lengthy title. This is basically due to the fact that as I record this video, we have a stellium in Pisces where you've got a retrograde Venus, a retrograde Mercury Stationing Direct, both conjunct to Saturn, and there's a dynamic where this trio of planets is making a trine to Mars and Cancer and making a sextile to Uranus and Taurus. And so this is like, and then, of course there's other things going on as well too. I was kind of thinking that for this video, rather than let's simplify things a bit and talk about Saturn and Pisces in a sextile to Uranus and Taurus on their own, even though there's a lot of other planets involved right now. And to be fair, the idea that I have for this video, I had it in my, like, I could easily take this idea and then make a video on another channel that doesn't have anything to do with astrology and just try to basically just remove the astrology from this idea and try to present it in a different context. However, I realized that the themes or the archetypes with my idea actually work pretty well for the astrology, namely a conversation about the role of the planet Uranus in all this dynamic. And so in the midst of this really busy dynamic with a lot of planets aspecting each other, I'm going to focus more on Uranus right now. And basically, if you think about it, in context with the Saturn and Pisces and in the sextile to Uranus and Taurus, what we're talking about here is an astrology, like the advent of modern astrology is a kind of a paradigm shift in a way, right? Because the practice of astrology goes all the way back to ancient times, but however, it was only in recent modern times that when we developed the better telescopes and better scientific tools that we were able to discover the planet Uranus, discover the planet Neptune and Pluto, discover a lot of these small, what you might call dwarf planets or asteroids, or these minor planets, or the trans-Neptunians, all that kind of stuff, right? And the majority, some people may take a very traditional approach where you just stick to the traditional form of astrology and omit the outer planets. But it seems like the majority of astrologers prefer to include these outer planets into their system, right? And I'm not going to get too bogged down into the technical details about that, but it's also important to consider that the meaning of these planets, especially when we talk about Uranus, that Uranus has come to be associated with things such as scientific and political revolution. That there is a kind, and the Western Enlightenment, as you would say, right? And that there's a certain kind of break from tradition, break from the old way of doing things, and a kind of this spirit of liberation, emancipation, and that kind of thing is all bound up in the archetype of Uranus. And it's interesting, and then you can contrast that with Saturn, that Saturn, in traditional astrology, was the limit of the farthest planet that you could see with the naked eye in the night sky. And that was, Saturn was associated with things like death and old age and things like people reaching the limit of their life or reaching the limit of their personal ability, that kind of stuff. And so there's a certain thing that Saturn is often associated with a kind of disappointment or bitterness, or like, oh, sadness that some things are coming to an end, or that something's over, or maybe you didn't get quite what you wanted, and there's this kind of like where Jupiter is very like all about continuing to grow and to continuing to be abundant. There's something about Saturn where it's like the wall, where you hit the wall and you're like, oh, I guess that's it. I guess we just have to settle for this. And it's sort of there's a kind of a grumpy, like kind of the grumpy old man quality that's associated with Saturn in the old age and all this kind of stuff that is like the idealistic dreams of youth have been, the old man has seen when those the youthful energy and idealism reaches its limit, and kind of knows from experience where the limits are and stuff like that, right? But then what's interesting is that Uranus is like the one step further that opens up a whole new paradigm on the other side of that limit. And it's also kind of interesting that apparently the what I said about Saturn being the furthest planet you can see with the naked eye is only actually a partial truth, because apparently under the right conditions you can actually see Uranus with the naked eye, but it's only at very specific points and times when Uranus is close enough to the Earth to be visible. But Uranus has this kind of quality of maybe like peeking through or something like that, right? Or like a certain surprise, like, oh, I didn't expect that to be there or something, right? Now, with all this in mind, I recently, I'm a Canadian, and we're headed into this trade war with the United States. The whole world is apparently being hit by all these tariffs and stuff like that. And honestly, one of the things that if you notice, I like to collect books. It seems to be a possibility that books may be an item that is hit by this tariff. So before that comes into effect, I figured I would at least I ordered a bunch of books so that, might as well stock up on some books before the tariff comes in, and then give myself something to read over this course of time. And one of the books that I chose, that I've started, it's a very thick book, so it's going to take me a while to read this. And so also take this with, like, I only made it to chapter 3 here so far, so I'm only talking about the first bit that I've read. But I ended up getting this book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And this one, David Graeber passed away during the pandemic, and I was inspired to read him because I'm a big Adam Curtis fan. And Adam Curtis made a documentary, one of his more recent ones. He included a quote from David Graeber that was talking about how the truth of the world is that it's something that we make, and we could just as well make it differently, right? And, we're going through a time where obviously it feels like we're going through some kind of major change as a civilization, or as a way that we do politics, or the way that we do government. And I think there's a lot of protests going on right now against Donald Trump, but I think that part of the problem is that it's not just a protest against Donald Trump, but rather the fact that this situation that we're in is playing out the way that it has, I think reflects a kind of an obvious, deeper dissatisfaction from Americans at the impotence of their own political system, right? Or the idea that apparently democracy is supposed to give people the ability to, if they are unhappy with the way things are, that they have the ability to vote for a candidate who's going to give them some kind of a change. But, you don't have to necessarily agree with Trump and MAGA and all that kind of stuff to sympathize with this kind of idea that the old political system doesn't seem to offer very much change. It seems to just accept that the way we do things because this is the way things are, and this is the way we have to do things, and we don't have any option to change or redesign our our culture or civilization, or come up with different approaches to things, that we're basically stuck in this dynamic, and the only tool in the toolbox, we have, like, like when politicians are elected, they have certain tools in their toolbox, right? And you, from a conservative point of view, this is usually like trying to lower taxes or to like slash programs, right? Other than this, you don't, like, politicians don't have very many options for what they can do. And if you want to radically change things so that you have more options for different approaches to take, there's a lot of resistance against this, right? And it feels like I think this is like with the Saturn-Uranus dynamic, is that Saturn kind of feels like something that's become kind of old and crusty and kind of just like hardened in its ways of doing things and is not flexible or open to change. And Uranus is like a break from that old way of doing things, right? It was in this kind of spirit that I was kind of felt like reading some David Graeber books. I've also, if you look, YouTube is great because you can, there's a lot of lectures David Graeber has done that you can just, for a lot of these books, sometimes you can get the message of the book by just listening to these guys give a talk about their book, right? But anyways, I'm reading this book now, and from the get-go, basically, there's probably all sorts of different directions they take this later in the book. I'm only at the beginning. But the basic gist of this is talking about the whole idea of the French Revolution and the Western Enlightenment and all this kind of stuff, and how that the way that we tell these stories tends to downplay the effect or the influence of the indigenous people that we encountered during colonialism, right? And basically what they're saying is that in medieval times, prior to the Renaissance, prior to the Enlightenment and all this kind of stuff, you had basically the only people that were educated were the elite or members of the church, and most people were just uneducated peasants. And the idea of like the way you would tell a story about your origin stories would be there wasn't any reason really to go in more depth than what the Bible would say. And there's a kind of a mythic. The Bible is very mythical, right? That you've got Adam and Eve, you've got the fall from the Garden of Eden, you've got Cain and Abel, you've got the Tower of Babylon, the Book of Genesis, all that kind of stuff. There's not, some people have interpreted this idea of the fall from the Garden of Eden as actually maybe an allegory or a metaphor for perhaps maybe the Garden of Eden is human beings in a kind of natural state before they become civilized, before they become an agrarian culture. And there's this idea that they talk a lot in this book so far about a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is credited as being one of the most influential thinkers to sort of kick off the French Revolution, but only in the sense that, basically with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he wrote something where he was using this idea of what you would call the noble savage, or that the idea of a state of innocence, the idea of like a pre-agricultural society where you had hunter-gatherers, and that some idea that there was a kind of like purity before agriculture, before civilization, because in a hunter-gatherer society there wasn't a hierarchical system of division of labor, and there wasn't this kind of domination and control, and that people. But the thing is, what's interesting is that in this book that I'm reading, that they argue that these ideas didn't just come out of nowhere, that they were actually influenced and inspired by the French colonialists encountering indigenous people and dealing with indigenous people, and even some of these people bringing indigenous people back to France, and there actually being a kind of a cross-cultural exchange, right? And to basically highlight this, there was this kind of idea that prior to the French Revolution, there's this kind of idea that you had a structure in society where you had an absolute monarchy, where the king was God's chosen representative, and that if you were against the king, you were also against God, and you were basically, not only were you rebellious, you were like satanic or pagan or something, or there was this basic this idea that everything was exactly as it had to be, and that the king was sort of like the human embodiment of this divine order on earth, and that if you wanted to know about what your history was like, you read the Bible, and that's the end of the story, right? But it was what they kind of argue was that it was the French encounter of the colonialists with the indigenous people who had a completely different way of living, who didn't really think very highly of the sort of civilized society where you have basically all you had a lot less freedom because you had to follow all the orders of the king, right? Or you had to listen to all your superiors. They're basically arguing that in indigenous society there were leaders, but the thing was that there wasn't such a tight regime of control where if you were an indigenous person and the leader had some sort of idea that you didn't like, you didn't really have any obligation to follow along with that idea if you didn't like it. And so that indigenous people had to there was more of a cooperative spirit, that it wasn't just like you had to do this because we order you to or else, but rather treating everybody's doing this because they all agree is the right thing to do or something like that. And that from this perspective, they're saying, why would you want to have all these hierarchical levels above you of people that control your life and, tell you what to do and all this kind of stuff? And why would we want to give up our way of life to have you guys rule over us in this really dominating way, right? And so there's something about like that, and then bringing these indigenous people over to France and actually having these people experience indigenous, civilized European culture, and them saying like, well, we kind of like our way of doing things better. I mean, the thing is, this kind of thing is a big point of controversy in politics, because there's this issue where conservatives don't kind of dismiss the fact that maybe indigenous people have anything to offer, or basically see like the whole project of like the Renaissance and Western Enlightenment as being an achievement of the advanced, evolved Western mind, and that there's something threatening basically about the idea that like, what if we aren't fundamentally better or superior than the indigenous people, than the natives, or that, what if we aren't like, just totally justified in colonizing and taking over all their land and all this kind of stuff, right? And there's also this kind of thing that they're making this argument that prior to this colonial influence of the indigenous people who it basically was evidence that there were other cultures who had different ways of doing things that did not order their society in the same way. I have to say, to qualify all this, there does seem to be a tendency, I find, when dealing with progressives, that they tend to sort of, because they're trying to like get away from this white supremacist position where that it's all about how, because we were obviously, the white people were obviously more scientifically advanced. You don't have to argue that. It's like, it's a settled fact that we had much more scientific advancement at that point. We were a culture at a different stage of development, right? And that there is, one of the things that I got from reading McLuhan is that I think because maybe McLuhan was a bit more old-fashioned, he didn't really embody the spirit of the 1960s, but he was a bit old-fashioned, and he wasn't afraid to, there's certain things that like you don't hear people mention as much anymore. And one of these things was that most indigenous cultures were very limited when it came to things like mathematics, right? And so basically you could kind of imagine that if you have a culture where your worldview is built up around really putting a lot of value on what you can do with mathematics, or the intelligence that goes with mathematics, or the technology and the science that uses mathematics as a foundation, that if you are really valuing that kind of skill, and then you find other cultures that do things very differently, but they are deficient when it comes to that skill or that ability, that they have really not developed their mathematical ability very much. From that perspective, you're like, okay, we are obviously better than all these people who can't do math, right? Or don't have the sophisticated mathematical or linguistic system the same way that we do, right? And so I think a lot of progressives are kind of like, they don't want to focus on that very much, and instead they want to focus on that maybe there's something, we're not going to argue that point, but maybe there are certain things to do with indigenous ways of worldviews that still have some value, even if that value isn't that they have a mathematical system that's as good as ours or something like that, right? So it's like you have to sort of take it with a grain of salt in that sense. But I think it's easy to make those kinds of points a straw man, where you're like, oh, the progressives have their head up their ass because they're naive and they think that the indigenous people were these wise people or whatever, when really they just didn't know how to do math or something, right? So there is you have to kind of make a concession to say that we are more but in this whole process, right, of this, it reminded me basically that I had this book is called The Dawn of Everything, and as I was reading this, I kept remembering that in my habit of going to secondhand bookstores and collecting books, I had another book with a similar title called A Brief History of Everything by Ken Wilber, and this is one that has just sat on my shelf that I haven't really read very much, but I have recently, keep thinking about Ken Wilber and his integral system, which is, the thing is, it's not even, to be fair, it's not really so much Ken Wilber, but rather this thing about spiral dynamics. And to explain where I'm going with this, it basically came out of, I have to admit that I don't even know how popular this stuff is these days. And it's I think they're it could in some way be a kind of oversimplified system of understanding things or whatever. What Ken Wilber tries to do is to take a bunch of these different maps and kind of layer them together and try to integrate them and come up with this integral model of understanding everything. And what I find was interesting is, by reading this David Graeber book, is is David Graeber going to be uprooting something that of this integral Ken Wilber project, or or does it hold up, right? The other thing about all this is that I have been trying to read Friedrich Nietzsche books, and something about trying to just make sense of Friedrich Nietzsche and what his whole project is about, I find myself going back to this idea of spiral dynamics, right? If you think about what Nietzsche was doing, he was I read his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and that's basically influenced by a number of things. That he worked as a professor that studied the classics, the Greek myths and stuff like that. He was an expert on Greek mythology, right? And there's this idea that there was a transition point where it's it kind of goes with our calendar system. The reason, it could be that our Christian worldview, that the apparent birth of Jesus was why we have 00 whatever it is, the AD and BC. The idea that, or it was only maybe 500 years before Jesus that you had the Buddha. And from Nietzsche, there's this whole kind of attitude that there is some kind of shift in religion that happened with, I think you could also argue that there's a difference between the pre-Socratic Greeks and then Socrates and then Plato, and that this was kind of leading towards Christianity. And then there's this whole thing about Christian Neo-Platonism that kind of reconciles Plato with Christianity and kind of integrates them together. But basically the whole idea is that spiral dynamics, there's this model of evolutionary or developmental stages, and that there is Christianity and the values of Christianity represent basically what you call, it gets confusing because Wilber has a different color coding system, but I'm going to stick to the one that calls this one blue, just to make it simple, right? The blue stage, there's this whole idea of that you had the Roman Empire, which were all about basically conquering through imperialism and domination as a kind of just a might makes right mentality. And they also, if you go back to like the Greeks, you had there's lots of like, the Spartans, the war with the Trojans, right? There's a lot of, the Greeks are known for a very violent and bloody kind of beginning, a lot of war, right? And so there's this basically, I mean, whether or not, this may be a simplified version of understanding things, but there's this basic idea that prior to the advent of religions such as Buddhism and Christianity, there were people in a kind of more of a warlike, more kind of brutal state that we would, that in spiral dynamics, this is called red, which is easy to remember because you can think of the whole, blood red, Mars, anger, violence, all this kind of stuff with red, and then blue coming out of that is, if you think about what Jesus was all about, he was all about turn the other cheek, right? He was all like about the meek shall inherit the earth. He was, and there, and the thing is, in the whole, with Friedrich Nietzsche, there's a lot of what Nietzsche's doing is that he's studying Greek mythology, and then he's also thinking about Christianity, and he's, obviously Nietzsche has a big reputation of being anti-Christian, but the main thing about this is like, it's not so much about the difference between the mythical Greeks and this new Christian era, and this whole thing about the meek shall inherit the earth and turn the other cheek and love your enemy and all this kind of stuff. Like, a lot of what Nietzsche's project is doing is criticizing this, but not just to go back into history and to analyze this historical shift from one paradigm or one worldview to another, but rather to use this historical paradigm shift to understand what was happening in the present, which was not going back necessarily. Well, the thing is, it was kind of funny because this did lead to, you did end up, the science, I don't know, it's kind of complicated because we ended up having World War I, we ended up having World War II, and we ended up having all the red, the warlike part of us ended up coming out, right? But the thing is, the main issue here was that he was using this idea of paradigm shifts to, I mean, you could also argue that I'm getting things wrong. If you're a Nietzsche expert, feel free to leave comments and correct me, but this is how I'm interpreting it, that you had Nietzsche on the precipice of the scientific revolution, and all the idea that rationalism and science were opening up a new paradigm that didn't have to be dominated by Christian morality and Christian religion. And so there's this kind of, by using this kind of idea of the Greeks transitioning to Christianity, you could see that there's that similar moment that was transitioning away from Christianity into a new era that had a different worldview, right? And that the era, the scientific revolution, is associated with what we call the orange tier, or the orange stage of spiral dynamics. And typically the orange is associated with things like, well, while the blue was associated with, let's say, this is like, it's kind of funny because like when I don't know if I get this as much as being a Canadian, but I noticed that when I spent a year in Australia, the Australians were more familiar with what they would call tall poppy syndrome, which is like if you are ambitious and you want to succeed and you want to stand out from the crowd, or you want to do something unique and special or something like that, there's a whole attitude where a lot of people will try to like cut you down to size, or kind of take a sort of like they don't like the idea that you're going to, like, you think you're so good or something like that, that you're too, you know, you got a big ego that you think you're going to do all this great stuff or something like that. And there's something about this kind of attitude that I think goes with the blue worldview, which is more about people being like, when you think about, if you read the old Christian, it's kind of funny because it's like, if you go back and read Christian mystics, there's something about the way their worldview, or the way that seems very different from the culture that we live in, because there's a certain kind of attitude that can be very self-effacing, right? To be very, you know, like, oh, what a lowly wretch I am. You know, it is like, I have no, you know, it's only for the grace of God that he takes pity on me for my lowliness, and that I have no intelligence or basic, you know, I have no, you know, I'm just a worthless wretch, and it's only by the grace of God's gifts that he imparts me the ability to be this, to provide you with this service, and I'm humble before all this great, you know, like, that's the kind of the blue. If you're really centered at blue, it has this really self-effacing quality to that you are humbling yourself and bowing down in honor of this thing that is the God, or the good, the beautiful, and the true, or this principle, this higher transcendent virtue that you are just, you know, that you have to be very self-effacing in the face of, right? What the orange rationalism marks, or the orange tier, or orange stage, I would say. Now, I'm using the word tier, which is different because there's a second tier in spiral dynamics, which I'm not going to get into right now. But there's this idea of the orange instead puts a value in personal achievement and individualism, right? That rather than valuing the person who is humble, who stays loyal to their family, to their in-group, to their tribe, or something like that, they're kind of saying that this is all just stuff which is basically oppressive, and that if you're intelligent, if you have a good idea, then you don't have to listen to all these people trying to tell you to be modest and humble. You need to, like, go for it and chase that idea and realize it, and you know, and make yourself you know, you could be like Isaac Newton, you could be like Albert Einstein, you could be these people that revolutionize the whole, and our understanding of things, and bring this new paradigm into existence. And, like, you know, how awful would it be if we had all these scientific advancements that were squashed by people that are accusing you of tall poppy syndrome, right? So there's this idea that there's this kind of conflict between orange and blue, and that's so much of, I think, there's so much of what you associate with Uranus, basically. To bring it back to the astrology now, what Uranus tends to represent is that the Uranus, that tends to often be associated with a scientific revolution, or also the idea of liberty, emancipation, freedom, all that kind of stuff in this context. And that it's basically, you could see that there's a kind of, like, Saturn being a kind of a limit between this blue stage and this orange stage, right? And that I've mentioned this in other videos, that I think if you want to understand what's going on in the politics of the United States, is that there is the American right wing their power is really based on trying to straddle these two different power centers, right? You have the people who are maybe less educated, who are more religious, who are more churchgoers, or more about, like, you know, about the meek shall inherit the earth and being humble or something like that, versus the freedom. But the thing is, it's kind of funny because, like, even that, like, I think in American Christianity, that's almost kind of anachronistic, because they're starting to, like, you know, they're incorporating this idea that it's all about freedom rather than about being, like, you know, faithful and loyal to your tribe or whatever, right? Or we would say, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but there's this idea that, like, the whole conversation about Uranus, I think it really goes with this idea of shifting into this worldview that values individualism, that values the technology, it values new discoveries, that values pushing the evolutionary paradigm further or something like that. And then the thing about this is that in the system of spiral dynamics, there's the next stage after orange is called green, and Ken Wilber there's this, I keep linking to it. I don't know if it's necessary to link it to it again. I'll put the link in the comments. When Trump got in the first time, Ken Wilber did this interview where he was talking about how he basically interpreted the rise of Donald Trump and the rise of populism to a backlash against the green stage, right? And the green stage basically represents postmodernism, multiculturalism, pluralism, environmentalism, and also queer politics, transgender stuff, all that kind of stuff, right? And if you look at what Trump is taking aim at by slashing, or like, it was kind of funny that Trump and Elon Musk, I think Elon Musk is a great example of this, because if you think about Elon Musk, what was that? What Elon Musk's big claim to fame was the thing about electric cars, right? Now, I don't know if I look young for my age, but I'm a millennial, and I remember very clearly what it was like before Tesla and Elon Musk and all this kind of stuff, that it seemed absolutely absurd. Like, why don't we have electric cars? Why are we so, why, I mean, it's not saying that we can it may be idealistic to say that we could try to completely get off of oil and gas, but there was obviously technology for electric vehicles, and it was kind of like, why isn't this happening? It just didn't make sense. It felt like a conspiracy that the oil and gas companies were intentionally suppressing green technologies such as electric vehicles, right? And this is basically initially people thought very highly of Elon Musk because he was the guy. A lot of people say that it's not that, he's a businessman. It's not like Elon Musk developed all the technology himself, but he was the guy who got us through that obstacle. That for some reason we had this artificial roadblock of why can't we do this? We have all sorts of, we have all sorts of scientific know-how, but we have this roadblock, and why can't we have electric cars, right? And the thing is, the electric cars, on one hand, you could look at it from an orange point of view of it's just a new scientific development, a new technological development. It's just scientific progress continuing to go. But the thing is, the main thing is that it appeals to the green stage of development. That is the leading edge of progressivism, which values things like environmentalism, and that puts an emphasis on green technologies, right? But I find it very funny that somehow Elon Musk himself has somehow did this backslide into fascism, he managed to push as far as they could into green, and now they've hit some point where they can't do green, and now they're falling. This is what in spiral dynamics and in integral they basically call a shadow crash. That we're trying to push our developmental paradigm into green, but we have unresolved shadow areas in these other stages of development where it's if you get the whole environmental thing, that's great, but then there's other parts of the green that have to do with multiculturalism, environmentalism, that kind of stuff. That is it's funny because now you see, Donald Trump is afraid of windmills, right? Donald Trump is strictly anti-windmill. And he's also drill baby drill as a really into the oil and gas thing, or that I think the American Republicans have a big a lot of their power structure comes from basically a lot of I think a lot of the Republican or the right wing power structure comes from the combination of appealing to the blue worldview of traditionalism, of traditional Christianity, or whatever, and then the orange worldview of the emancipation that comes from technical prowess or an industry and capitalism and business and stuff like that, right? And that the whole point is that if you do not if you can't play the game of politics without dealing with big business, without dealing with industry, without dealing with capitalism, it's just a non-starter. You would not be able to have, like, it would be, if you had just a blue level, it would be like the equivalent of having the Amish running for government. Like, you can't have like, Amish people are never going to have that kind of political power, because you need to, like, the bottom line basically is that if you are going to have if people want to have an Amish community where they're just going to, like, reject modern technology and just have horse and carriage and no internet or whatever it is, like, you can do that, sure, but when it comes to national security, and we live in we live in 2025, and you need to have a military to protect you from the threat of other people's militaries, the Amish people aren't going to be flying fighter jets. The Amish people aren't going to be, developing crazy drone warfare or whatever, right? Like, it's like you need to have the Amish people. So there's this kind of thing, like, it's a non-starter. You need to have. We're not going to be able to have a government that rejects technology, that rejects business. That is like kind of a redundant thing to point out, right? So you have to. Our governments have to be at this orange center of development, and there's something going on right now where so much of the politics is still what Wilber describes as this backlash against green, but it's very confused. It's very strange in that, like, it's even the guy himself that was spearheading that push to get to start resolving, because this is the basic conflict. Is that from the orange level, it's like that our main power comes from scientific understanding of big business and technological advancement, then the more you work at that level, the more you start to get byproducts such as pollution, such as climate change, such as all the environmental problems, right? And so I'm raised by a family of environmentalists, and I have been raised with a lot of these principles. But there's this thing, there's for some reason postmodernism gets a bad rap. It gets a bad name. And there's some kind of, like, this is basically what I'm going to read a bit from this Ken Wilber book, basically, about this. And so this is also, I just like to point out that there's something really, like, I bought this book from a secondhand bookstore, and there's something really funny about, like, when you buy books from secondhand bookstores, and they are like when you look at whoever owned the book before you has made notes in it and stuff like that, and it's kind of funny because, like, this person, whoever was making notes in this book, was, like, really extreme about it. Like, I don't know if you can you see this? Like, it's like this. Like, this is the first couple chapters are just, like, every page is, like, there's this kind of thing, like, one of these things is that, like, if you're the kind of person who likes highlighting things, like, when you, like, highlight every single thing on the page, it starts to be, like, kind of ridiculous. Or, like, there's also this, like, I actually started reading, like, this person was actually having a full out conversation with the book in the margins, and then I decided to start writing, my own notes in a different color, so to have this kind of conversation with I mean, it's kind of a bit of a joke, but this is what I find really funny about this is that it looks like there's this person who got this book and was just, like, highlighting everything, making all kinds of notes. They were really revved up and they're really excited about this. And then who knows what happened, but it's like they only got to chapter. Well, it could be, like, I don't know. It is what it is. Sometimes you start reading books and you like, who knows what happened, right? I can only speculate. But this person only got to chapter 3, and then it's like all the notes just stopped. They just gave up, right? And as I read the notes, what I get from it is that you've had some person who's really excited about this, what the promise of this book is, right? That maybe somebody has, like, there's this whole issue about the scientific paradigm and the spiritual religious paradigm between the blue stage and the orange stage that is like trying to resolve that difference, right? Where you're like that, and I think if you go back to the early days of the internet, I remember when I was a youngster back in like the Y2K kind of era, early 2000s, and if you were hanging out on whatever random forum or whatever random message board, there's the early debate bros. There was a huge dynamic where people were arguing for either in favor of Christianity and traditional religion or in favor of atheism and a kind of rationalistic science, right? And you have people like Richard Dawkins or Neil deGrasse Tyson. Those guys really represent this kind of worldview that basically see the problem on those terms, right? And this is kind of funny too, because it's like my own. I feel like when I deal with my family, when I talk to my mom, that she is very much one of these I guess she was. For some reason, my mom really doesn't like Christianity, and she raised me a Unitarian, and I think Unitarianism was a way to somehow retain some kind of thing about the spirit of religion or the spirit or the value of that kind of stuff. But there's some kind of attitude of like really not wanting to be caught in those kind of traditional dogmas, or not. We're valuing things like the Unitarians were one of the first churches to be more accepting of gay and lesbian people, my mom always explained this to me, that the problem that she had with Christianity is that they tend to be like one religion will say you have to accept Jesus as your savior or else you're going to hell, and so that makes our religion right and all the other ones wrong, and then there's all this religious violence on top that comes out of that. And then it's also like, even if you were to accept Christianity itself, then if you compare you have things like the Protestants versus the Catholics in, where there even subdivisions or internal divisions within the religion itself can be the source of all sorts of violence and bloody warfare that seems to be completely, if you look at what the principle is about Jesus, like turn the other cheek and love your enemy and all this kind of stuff, it seems to like, it's kind of self-defeating if you're like, okay, our principles are that we are, rather than, it's a higher truth to love your enemy and to turn the other cheek and choose nonviolence. But then if you're on the wrong side of the Protestant Catholic divide, we're just going to kill you, right? And like, it's like, how does that work? Where the fuck do you guys come out? It's like, there's some kind of thing where I don't know, this is basically just how I was raised, with this kind of attitude of my family just not being very Christian, because that's kind of how they saw it. They did not take, they thought it was much better to have a scientific, rationalistic worldview, and to, and there's something, there's some unresolved problem between red and blue, where between the attitude of being are you going to turn the other cheek and love your enemy, or are you going to go on a crusade and kill all the people who don't believe the right thing, right? Like, it's kind of like, there's this kind of contradiction within that. But what I like about spiral dynamics is that it gives you an explanation for why that is, right? And then the whole thing is that it's not that one of these, at some basic level, the problem thing is that even if we value peace and nonviolence and anti-war and stuff like that, there is this basic level that if you are completely pacifistic, if you're completely, like, at some point there may be some threat of whether it's maybe it's an invading army, or maybe it's a band of robbers or criminals, that at some point in time, you may need to defend yourself from some kind of a threat, right? So that at some basic level, it's not so, like, even though there's so much suffering and bad stuff that comes from war and violence, at some level, it may be necessary to defend yourself from a threat or something, right? But so there's that. But the thing is that the modern person carries within themselves all these historical influences. That we have the red warrior, we have the blue humble churchgoer, we have the orange scientific revolutionary entrepreneur or something, businessman, and then we have this green progressive environmentalist, right? But the thing is, there's some kind of, okay, I'm gonna read you. There's something about this is that in order to deal with the green level, is that it's necessary to approach the problem of postmodernism. And what is funny about this, reading this book, is that the person who's making all these notes in this book was like, they basically, it looks like somebody who's really gung-ho to, who's at this level of blue-orange and trying to be like, I believe in science, but I also believe in God and religion, and like I'm really excited to read this book because this is going to I have these sort of things I'm confused about, and this guy's going to give me the answers, and it's all just like the tension of the conflict is going to be resolved, and it's all just one. It's all one, baby. It's all God. It's all beautiful. It's all truth. Yeah. And then you get to the chapter where they like you start reading this, and you get to this. You start reading a you get to the chapter where he says, beginning especially with Kant and running through Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Dilthey, Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, all the great postmodern theorists, there's no notes in this at all. As soon as this person got to this chapter, they're like, no thanks, nope, we're not talking about those guys, right? No. So and this is what's really funny is that I still run into this attitude where there's some kind of extreme prejudice against people who might be considered postmodernists, or people who might be considered critical theorists, or I don't know, or there's this division where people just don't want to go there. They just don't know, we're not going there. And this is precisely why you're not integral, right? Is that if you're really going to go for the integral approach, you can't take a certain thing and just be like, this stuff sucks, we're not going to do it. Like you have to go the whole hog basically on this, right? And so this is going to be a longer video, but I'm just going to go for it because I have this idea and I just want to get it out there, right? So I'm going to read a bit from here. This is from chapter 4, The Great Postmodern Revolution. The general point is also, this is an interview style, but I'm just going to read some little bits here. The general point is fairly simple. Different stages of consciousness growth present a different view of the world. The world looks different, is different at each stage. As new cognitive capacities unfold and evolve, the cosmos looks at itself with different eyes and sees quite different things. For convenience, I generally call these worldviews archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and existential, with higher stages possible. You can see these on figure 5.2. So what are the different ways that we can look at the world? So these are different ways that we can look at the world. Yes, but we have to be very careful here. This might seem to be splitting hairs, but it's really very important. It's not that there is a single pre-given world and we simply look at it differently. Rather, as the cosmos comes to know itself more fully, different worlds emerge. It's like an acorn growing to an oak. The oak isn't a different picture of the same unchanging world present in the acorn. The oak has components in its own being that are quite new and different from anything found in the acorn. This is kind of like going in a different direction than what James Hillman uses with the oak acorn, but we're going to go with it. The oak has leaves, branches, roots, and so on, none of which are present in the acorn's actual worldview or world space. Different worldviews create different worlds, enact different worlds. They aren't just the same world seen differently. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. the overall idea that worldviews develop, that neither the world nor the self is simply pre-given, that is the great postmodern discovery. Faced with this discovery of not pre-given, a theorist can then take one of two routes through this new and confusing postmodern landscape where nothing is foundational. First, and probably most common, is to go to the route of extreme constructivism, which is the strong version of not pre-given. That is, because worldviews are not pre-given, you can claim that they are all arbitrary. They are simply constructed by cultures based on nothing much more substantial than shifting tastes. So we have all these books with titles like Social Construction of Sex, Social Construction of Food, The Social Construction of Labor, The Social Construction of Clothing, and so on. I keep expecting to see something like the social construction of the large intestine. And this is kind of a joke because one of the issues with Nietzsche was that he died, he got some kind of intestine cancer. Same with H.P. Lovecraft, interestingly enough, right? So there's this kind of thing about, well, I don't know if that, like, there's something about, Nietzsche was actually, people said that when they're talking about Nietzsche, that he was taking his philosophical project so seriously that it wasn't, for him, it's not just something like a mental idea, but it's a whole body process to the point where you're taking your whole project so seriously that you could even make yourself sick by doing it, right? And so that Nietzsche like kind of made himself sick and crazy by really struggling with this problem, maybe, right? I don't know if that's what he kind of was implying or not, but he says, everything is socially constructed. This is the mantra of the extremist wing of postmodernism. They think that different cultural worldviews are entirely arbitrary, anchored in nothing but power or prejudice or some ism or another. Sexism, racism, speciesism, phallocentrism, capitalism, logocentrism, and my favorite, phallo-logocentrism. Wow, does that puppy come with batteries or what? Do those approaches have any merit at all? They do. It's only that the strong constructivist approach is simply too strong, too extremist. Worldviews just aren't that arbitrary. They are actually constrained by the currents in the cosmos, and those currents limit how much a culture can arbitrarily construct. We won't find a consensus worldview, for example, where men give birth or where apples fall upward. So much for arbitrary worldviews. They're not merely constructed in the sense of totally relative and arbitrary. Even Derrida now concedes this elemental point. A diamond will cut a piece of glass, no matter what words we use for diamond, cut, and glass, no matter what culture we find them in. It's not necessary to go overboard and deny the pre-existence of the sensor-motor world altogether. And that sensor-motor world, the cosmos, the bios, constrains the worldviews from below, so to speak. Further, cultural construction is limited and constrained by the currents in the noosphere itself. The noosphere develops, it evolves. That is, it also follows the 20 tenets, and those currents most definitely constrain and limit the construction. So in these many other ways, the real currents of the cosmos constrain worldviews and prevent them from being merely collective hallucinations. Worldviews, as we'll see, are anchored in validity claims, and these claims work because the currents are real. And this is basically, I think, it's become a bit of a straw man, unfortunately, for postmodernism, in the idea that there is it becomes this idea that postmodernism is supposed to mean that there is no truth or there is no reality aside from what we construct. But it's like, I don't know where people get this from. I just read what I like to read, but from my base, I think that this is a misconstrual of what postmodernism is about. But there's something about this that is funny in that people have started to call Donald Trump like the first postmodern president, because he seems to be a lot of the problem with Trump and is this kind of thing about post-truth, right? And if you listen to the Ken Wilber video that I put in the link in the comments, that he goes all over this with talking about how, this problem of aperspectival madness, where if no perspectives are better than any others, then nothing is, nothing means anything. This is where they get this whole thing about the meta crisis from, right? But, okay, put it very simply though, is that the point about this is that it's not the idea that or like, it's not the idea that there is no fundamental reality outside of the perspective, but the point is that once, like, let's take this from the idea of the orange stage that has to do with once we had Newtonian physics and what we started making these scientific discoveries and all this kind of stuff, that once we had access to a whole different technological, once we had this different worldview that was based on having better technological understanding, we could actually produce different technologies. And it's not just that we have a different understanding or different perspective, but that perspective actually has a creative capacity where we start making a new world where we have planes and airplanes and we have guns and bombs and all this other stuff, and that the actual landscape that we're inhabiting is now shaped by this other understanding that we have that wasn't there before, right? And the problem about this is that the more you do this, the postmodern worldview is basically part and parcel with this. And what's interesting though about this book though is that these guys are almost suggesting that this, in some way, that it happened together, because the green level was there as soon as we had to, the colonialists had to deal with indigenous people, right? Like, as soon as you're in this position where you're at a very highly advanced, developed culture, and then you're starting to meet and interact with other cultures that we can agree that aren't as advanced and developed in things like science, technology, and math, there's this kind of question of, like, how are you going to deal with these other cultures? All right? And, like, you could choose just to brutally conquer them and enslave them and or whatever, or you could try to educate them. And you try to be like, oh, we're going to teach you math and bring you up to speed, or else you could be like, can we, like, there might be multiple ways to do this, but even dealing with that question of how are we going to deal with this is a problem at the green paradigm. And basically, I'm over an hour now, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. But the whole point, though, is that we're having our Canadian election soon. And in this aftermath, I find it really interesting because there's certain people have this idea, maybe based on watching American politics, that there's this idea that the left wing has been it's also, I don't even know what people's idea about left and right is, but there's this idea that conservatism tends to be very in favor of big business, very in favor of resource extraction, very in favor of global trade and entrepreneurship and individualism. Like, if you have a clever business idea and you can, you have no obligation to be like, just to be humble and stay a peasant your whole life. If you have talent, you have skill, it's up to you to, make yourself a big entrepreneur and a big businessman and be like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and then your new ideas will revolutionize the world and change the landscape. And this is all very Uranus, right? This is why I'm doing this as an astrology video. Is that it's all very Uranus, and it's not that. Look, this is what I'm trying to say, is that it's not that you're living in a different reality from it's like you've got fragmented realities where you've got all these old-fashioned churchgoers, and you've got all these scientists, and you've got all these woke progressives, and they all have a different version of reality they're living in. It's that at one point in time, these realities weren't there because we didn't have the technology, right? Like, the idea is that the worldviews come into effect as the world itself actually grows and evolves, right? That there wouldn't be a need for environmentalism if we didn't have all these industrial factories and oil and gas industry, all the stuff that would be polluting. Like, if we didn't have that stage, that wouldn't be a problem. If we didn't have colonialism, then we wouldn't have to deal with the question of how to deal with indigenous people. You know what I'm trying to say? Or that there's this whole kind of like, it's like, what I'm trying to say here is that the conservatives are really interesting right now, especially in Canada. The Canadian conservatives, I find, are really interesting. I'm not going to vote for them, but in the sense that on one hand, conservatism is, it tends to mostly be about a rejection of environmentalist concerns, a rejection of green technologies, and as well as a rejection of multiculturalism and all this kind of stuff, for the sake of appealing to the old traditionalists and the business interests, which give them their power base. But here's the kicker. What's really interesting is that we now, in Canada, we have so many immigrants that if you're going to have any shot at getting a popular vote, you're not going to be able to do this fascist white ethno-state shit that, like, I am really shocked and disturbed that people are even talking, like, I'm hearing this word going around called, like, multiracial democracy. Like, shouldn't that just be a given? But there's this whole thing, if you go back to ancient Greece, you had a democracy where it was only you had a bunch of slaves, and women and children weren't allowed to vote. It was just each family had the man who was the head of the family could vote, and then this man owned, like, basically, before feminism came around, if you were a woman, you were the property of a man, right? If you're a woman, you weren't allowed to vote. You didn't have control over your own life. It was this the patriarchal system of authority. And basically, it's kind of odd because, like, I mean, this was the way the ancient Greeks did democracy, sure, but there's this kind of, like, very kind of top-down, like, it's not the democracy that we know today that has our progressive ideals. Well, I think part of what they're trying to argue in this book is that a lot of what comes to shape our idea of freedom and democracy and the Uranus principle of liberation and equality and egalitarianism and all this stuff actually might be the influence of the indigenous people who had a more of a pure culture where it wasn't like having this authority figure that just tells you what to do or else, and that you have to listen to, like, that they had less of a it was like a kind of inherently more collaborative kind of culture is what they're arguing, right? And that there's all sorts of ideas that are in our culture that we don't realize might have had their origins in our interactions with the indigenous people, right? And there's this kind of green stage has kind of been there all along, right? And what I'm talking about this, like, now we've got this new paradigm, this new postmodern paradigm where you would think that the conservatives are supposed to be against all this stuff, but if you're an immigrant imagine you're a Muslim person who immigrated, like, imagine you're a refugee from some war-torn country and you're Muslim, you're not even Christian, but then you are, like, if you try to assess how your worldview fits into this political system, you believe in the traditional culture and your value, you want that to be represented in how you vote, and you might have Nigerians from Africa who are very religious and Christian or something, or you may have any number of even Asian, for some reason even Asian people can be very conservative, like converting to Christian, but being very conservative and traditional about it. And they might they are literally the multicultural people that are being integrated, but for whatever reason, from their worldview, they don't see progressivism as being a good idea. So what you end up, it's this kind of contradictory thing where you've got a diverse, multicultural group of conservatives that are all collaborating together. And if you want to have a conservative party that works, you actually have to be multiculturally inclusive, because if you're going to have a conservative party that's going to be like, it's just about white Christian nationalists, so we're going to alienate the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Muslims, everybody else, and then all these people who like have nowhere to, they're either just not going to vote, or they're going to be like, maybe they're too old fashioned to want to vote for a very progressive agenda that's all about like enabling transgender surgeries or something. You're basically just like alienating. You have these people that could be a very strong help to get you the vote, or else you can alienate them for the sake of being a white nationalist, because apparently being a conservative at this point just means you're a Nazi, right? So like this, it's in Canada, it's a non-starter. If you're going to have a political company or a political project, a political party in Canada, in the same way that it would be like a non-starter to say that we're going to just be like an Amish. You can't have an Amish political party that rejects that we're just all going to go back to horse-drawn carriages and give up modern technology, and like, you know, no one's going to have a computer. Like that wouldn't work, right? That was a non-starter. It wouldn't work. In the same way that if you in Canada, if you were going to have an ethno-nationalist fascist thing, or like you're going to try to vote to be like, we're going to make everything just for the white Christian people, and then we're going to take the right to vote away from everybody who's not like this. It's not going to, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work at all, right? And so it's like it's really bizarre, because there's a lot of conservatives who are drawn into the Conservative Party to resist progressivism, to resist multiculturalism, to see multiculturalism and progressivism as why we live in this fragmented society, why the postmodernism means there's no truth, that nothing's real, it's all just what your opinion is. And it's like, this is actually these people. It's also funny because we're in this moment right now where the conservatives candidates are getting, like, it's also people who don't like cancel culture, right? That they're like, oh, it's the problem with the progressives is why there's cancel culture. But then the conservatives are canceling themselves now because they realize that, like, where the Canadian center of gravity is, if you go in, if you're like, there's all sorts of things that you have to play the game. And it's not just arbitrary, being like, I like this worldview better than this worldview. It's that we're at a certain stage of history where it's not just your perspective, it's like the actual landscape of the world that we're inhabiting is a multicultural landscape. And it's like, this is the whole thing about, like, what it's also kind of silly, this whole thing about this kind of fascism in America, is that if you were to take fascist ideology on its own terms and look at what it's saying, it's all about the continuity between blood and soil, right? We are the ancestral people of this land, and we resent these foreign invaders coming and, taking advantage of us, and we need to purify so to bring it back. So it's just the land for the people who are part of, and it's like, if you are the colonialists, if you follow that logic, it makes more sense that you would have indigenous conservatives or indigenous fascists who want to, like, well, let's kill Whitey and take our land back, right? Yeah. So it's like, it doesn't make any fucking sense at all to be this turns this thing where it's like American neo-Nazism or American fascism isn't about blood and soil. It's about the white race is somehow inherently superior, and also the white race is something that actually exists categorically, aside from just being like your ancestors come from a certain bioregion in which you evolve this way. But to say that because this is the whole thing, is that they generally tend to use this basic idea of, because the colonizers had more science and technology with math and all that kind of stuff, this is just an objective way to say that they were more developed, they were more superior. So that just means that they win, and that it's like, if you, but then it's kind of like, it doesn't really sound like the meek shall inherit the earth, the whole Christian ideal, right? It's like there's this kind of it's a very orange, it's this kind of orange worldview where we're not burdened by these old systems of morality or obligations, that it's like this science liberates us from the need to be moral, right? But then this opens up all these questions about what happens if you have some mad scientist who just wants to do all these crazy, like, what are you gonna do? Okay, morality, Christian morality is old-fashioned, it's out, so we're just going to torture people. Like, what if you do all these weird mad scientist experiments on people that has no sense of morality at all, and just flat out evil, but you're like, oh, well, you can't prove that God exists, so I can do whatever I want. It'll be terrible, right? Nobody wants that. And I think that I think religious traditionalists are rightfully concerned about things that we would call transhumanism. That, like, they're like, it's like what if you could change what if you could do all sorts of things to your body to transform it, or to either extend your life, or you're forever young, you're not aging, or not never mind just the transgender stuff, but also like, why is nobody talking about Neuralink? Right? Why is it always that everyone's afraid of like people getting gender reassignment surgery or kids getting hormone blockers, but like they're not that, you don't see, well, there is that criticism to, like, you don't want to have a fucking, computer chip put in your brain, right? Like, but this, like, regardless of what your opinion is about this, the landscape we're in is a landscape where these concerns are actually things that we have to deal with, whether you take the side of agreeing with them or disagreeing with them or fighting them or trying to use that as your new entrepreneur business, right? You could take any approach to this. You could resist it if you want, or you could say that, oh, I'm going to become an entrepreneur and I'm going to develop my own brand of brain chips, right? Regardless of how you want to deal with it, the point is that we now live in a world where this is something that we have to deal with one way or another. In the same way we have to deal with environmentalism, the same way that we're going to have to deal with multiculturalism, in the same way that we're going to have to deal with gender diversity, or the gay and lesbian people. It's all stuff that we have to deal with. And it's just a question of, are you guys going to want to deal with this like a bunch of fascists, or are we going to try to evolve or develop something better, basically, right? And so that's basically what I wanted to say. And it's also like, to me, it just seems like we're in this moment where I think it's a historical moment where we have the old fashioned, like Saturn and Uranus. We have some sort of the revolutionary, emancipatory development of something new versus something that's old fashioned and crusty and all this kind of stuff. And it's like the idea that, you could also think about this in astrology, where like we could just use traditional astrology, not talk about the outer planets and just stick to that. But in the way that, you can, the technological revolution can give birth to this whole different way of doing astrology, where you add in like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. It's like, it's not that this is just like a perspective. It's actually that these planets are actually there, and they have been there the whole time. Right? And that there's always been a factor of reality that has to do with multiculturalism, right? That has to do with how do you deal with people who have different perspectives, or that there could be, gay and lesbian people throughout history that were just, we didn't pay so much attention to them. They were pushed, they had to be in the closet, they had to be hiding, right? And it's sort of like these things that it's like, it's not, in some way, it's not even new, but it's just that there's our new paradigm recognizes that these people are there, and that we have a new opportunity to solve these problems in a more progressive, more evolved way, basically, right? And I think that this kind of, it's not just, but the thing is, it's not about an arbitrary thing where your beliefs or what you think is just somehow arbitrary, that you can just take whatever perspective you want, and any opinion is as good as any other. That there is actually a real world that we have to deal with, and the only reason why these paradigms are an issue to begin with is because they are part of the real world, and that there's no way we can just, we're not going to go back in time we can only go forward. Time only moves in one direction. We can only keep progressing, and that's how it goes, right? So I don't know. This is a kind of a longer video. I just had this idea. I figured I'd express it. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Have a good one.